When we think of ancient Rome, we picture mighty emperors, grand palaces, and legendary gladiators. But behind all that power and wealth, there was another side to Rome, one that rarely gets talked about: the peasants, the backbone of the empire, the ones who toiled from sunrise to sunset, fed the cities, and built the roads, only to be rewarded with misery, hunger, and backbreaking labor. While emperors dined on exotic feasts, these people barely had enough to survive. In this video, we're uncovering the brutal truth about Roman peasant life. If you think history was all glory and greatness, just wait until you see what the majority of Romans really lived through. Who were the Roman peasants? Roman society was built like a pyramid. At the top, the emperor, worshipped like a god. Beneath him, senators, generals, and the ultra-rich elite. Then came merchants, craftsmen, and soldiers. But at the very bottom, making up around 80% of the population, were the peasants, the farmers, laborers, and common workers who kept Rome running. These people weren't slaves, but they weren't exactly free either. Many worked the land, growing food for an empire that barely cared whether they lived or died. Others were craftsmen, struggling to earn enough money to feed their families. They paid taxes, fought in wars, and built the empire brick by brick. But they got none of the glory. So what was life like for these people? Let's start with their daily routine. Daily life. Work from dawn to dusk. If you were a Roman peasant, there was no such thing as a weekend. There were no holidays, no breaks, just work, work, and more work. Farming. A life of endless labor. Most peasants were farmers, working on land they didn't even own. Wealthy landowners controlled huge estates, and peasants either had to rent land from them or work in exchange for a place to live. From dawn to dusk, they plowed fields using basic wooden tools, no fancy iron plows for them. Harvested crops under the burning sun, often with nothing but rags to protect them. Fought off droughts, floods, and locust swarms, knowing that a bad harvest meant hunger and debt. And just when they thought they might get ahead, taxes and rent, the crushing burden. Even though they worked the land, peasants had to pay heavy taxes, often in the form of food. That meant that after months of backbreaking labor, a huge portion of their crops went straight to the government. And tax collectors? They didn't care if your family was starving. They took what was owed, and if you didn't have enough, they might take your animals, land, or even your children as payment. Other jobs, the struggle to survive. Not every peasant was a farmer. Some worked as blacksmiths, weavers, or potters, but no matter the job, the pay was terrible. Craftsmen made tools, pottery, and clothes, but rich merchants controlled the trade, leaving little profit for workers. Fishermen sold their catch, but since only the rich could afford fresh fish, most of their best goods went to the wealthy. Laborers built roads, temples, and aqueducts, dangerous work with little reward. No matter what job they had, life as a peasant meant one thing: poverty. Living conditions, cramped and miserable. Forget about marble villas or fancy baths. A Roman peasant's home was a tiny, one-room shack made of mud bricks, wood, or straw. Inside, there was no furniture. Maybe a wooden table, a few clay pots, and some straw mats for sleeping. No plumbing, no toilets, no running water, just a hole in the ground or a communal pit outside. No heating. Winters were freezing, summers were boiling. The best they could do was light a small fire and hope they didn't freeze at night. To make things worse, many peasants shared their homes with animals. Goats, chickens, even pigs. The result? Dirty, disease-ridden conditions where illness spread like wildfire. Which brings us to the next brutal reality. What did peasants eat? If you think the Roman diet was all grapes, olives, and roasted meat, think again. That kind of feast was reserved for wealthy senators and emperors. For peasants, every meal was about survival, not luxury. Their main food was pulse, a bland, porridge-like mush made from barley or wheat. It was cheap, easy to make, and kept them alive, but it had little flavor and barely any nutrition. Some might add a few vegetables or cheese if they were lucky, but most of the time it was just a thick, tasteless sludge. Vegetables were a staple, but they weren't the fresh, juicy produce you might imagine. Peasants grew whatever they could: cabbage, onions, garlic, and beans, but these were often boiled down to mush or eaten raw. Meat was a luxury, A peasant might eat a small piece of pork, fish, or chicken during a festival or religious holiday, but most days they had to rely on eggs, cheese, or beans for protein. Drinking water was a problem. Most peasants couldn't trust their water sources, so they drank sour wine mixed with water, posca, or a vinegar-based drink that masked the taste of dirty water. Malnutrition was common. In bad harvest years, many peasants starved while the elite continued to feast on exotic delicacies without a care. Disease and death, a daily reality. Life expectancy for a Roman peasant? Maybe 40 years if you were lucky. But many didn't even make it that far. Disease was everywhere, and with no real medical care, even minor illnesses could turn deadly. One of the biggest killers was dysentery, a vicious stomach disease caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation. Most peasants drank from dirty wells, rivers, or communal water sources, which were often filled with human and animal waste. Without proper toilets, waste was dumped in the streets, spreading disease like wildfire. Diarrhea, dehydration, and fever could wipe out entire villages. Then there was tuberculosis and malaria. Roman peasants lived in cramped, poorly ventilated homes, making it easy for coughing and sneezing to spread deadly lung infections. And for those who worked in marshy farmlands, mosquitoes carrying malaria were an ever-present danger. Even a small cut or scrape could turn into a death sentence. With no antibiotics, simple wounds could become infected, leading to fever, sepsis, and death. And if you got too sick to work, no safety net, no government aid. You either begged on the streets or starved to death, just another forgotten soul in the empire. The crushing weight of taxes and debt. Imagine this. You've worked all year, harvested your crops, and finally have enough food for winter. But then the tax collectors show up. They don't care if your family will starve. They take what's owed. If you can't pay, you're thrown off the land or sold into debt slavery. Some peasants lost everything and were forced into the cities, where they became part of the urban poor, living in slums and begging for food. Did peasants have any fun? Life as a Roman peasant was a constant grind, but even the poorest found moments of joy, small escapes from their daily struggles. Entertainment was limited, yet it played a crucial role in keeping spirits high and preventing widespread unrest. Festivals were among the most anticipated events. The Roman calendar was filled with public holidays, many of which were religious celebrations dedicated to gods like Jupiter, Mars, or Saturn. These festivals gave peasants a rare break from work, allowing them to gather in the streets, enjoy free food, and watch public performances. For a brief moment, life felt lighter, less burdensome. For everyday entertainment, many peasants flocked to taverns. These dimly lit, smoky establishments served cheap wine and were a hub for socializing. People would gamble with knucklebones or dice, hoping to win a few extra coins, though most lost more than they gained. And then, of course, there were the gladiator games. While peasants couldn't afford the best seats, the Roman government sometimes sponsored free admission to keep the poor entertained. Watching warriors fight to the death was a thrilling, brutal distraction. But once the games ended, they were thrown back into their harsh reality. The end of the peasant class. As Rome expanded, peasant life only became harsher. What little land they had was constantly under threat from the wealthy elite, who were hungry for more power and control. Large estates, known as latifundia, began to dominate the countryside, run by slave labor instead of free farmers. This shift was devastating for peasants. They simply couldn't compete. With no land and no work, many were forced to abandon their rural homes and migrate to the cities, hoping for a better life. But the cities weren't a place of opportunity. They were overcrowded, disease-ridden, and dangerous. Instead of finding stable work, most peasants ended up in slums, packed into tiny, filthy apartments known as insulae. These buildings were often poorly built and prone to collapse or catching fire, turning daily life into a constant struggle for survival. With no steady income, many peasants became dependent on the government's free grain handouts, a desperate attempt by the state to prevent mass unrest. By the time the Roman Empire collapsed, the traditional peasant class had all but disappeared. Those who once farmed the land had either been pushed into poverty, absorbed into the urban poor, or replaced by slaves, leaving behind a society on the brink of ruin. Conclusion: would you have survived? The Roman Empire was built on the backs of peasants, yet they lived in misery while the rich indulged in luxury. So, after everything you've heard, could you have survived as a Roman peasant? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more brutal truths about history, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for the next video.